Good afternoon, all. My name is Krista McClure. I serve as the Programs Director here at Arts Business Collaborative. For those of you who may or may not know, Arts Business Collaborative is a nonprofit. We do national work, but we are based in New York. Our effort and intentionality is to support artists and those who are focused on STEM, that are Black, Latina, and Indigenous through kind of their endeavors, whether they are a visionary, entrepreneur, and or an organization that's been kind of operating as a nonprofit, and they are looking for support and getting a footing and understanding kind of the systems to be, if you will, of the nonprofit sector, but without having to shift away from their meaningful work as a in the visionary that they have for their org. The conversation we will be talking about today is demystifying fiscal sponsorship, and I have the wonderful privilege of having Thaddeus Squire join me from the Social Impact Commons, and I will let them take it from here.
All right, thanks, Krista. Really a pleasure and an honor to be here today and talk to the Arts Business Collaborative community about fiscal sponsorship, and hopefully be able to clarify some questions and demystify some myths about the practice as we go forward. So just to jump right in, I'm going to share my screen here. And I should mention while I'm doing this that my background is in arts and culture. I started out as a musician and a curator, and then decided that I really didn't like wearing a curatorial hat because it involved picking and choosing, and that's not my preference. I like facilitating people's visions and ideas and helping them see them to reality, whether I personally like them or agree with them or not. I feel like it's an act of social justice and welfare to kind of help others realize their visions in the world. So that was what drew me to fiscal sponsorship initially, and I did start a fiscal sponsor, a comprehensive fiscal sponsor. We'll talk about what that means, called CultureWorks Greater Philadelphia, which led me into this field. CultureWorks is still around. They serve the arts and heritage community of Greater Philly, and that ultimately led to Social Impact Commons, which is a support organization for the fiscal sponsorship ecosystem nationally. We also work with other types of multi-entity and solidarity economy-oriented organizations like community land trusts, healthcare networks, mutual aid societies, things of that nature. So a little bit of background on me and what we do at Impact Commons. So here, let me share. And hopefully that's resolving well on your side, Krista. Yeah?
Correct. Looks good.
Great. I'm always afraid I'm sharing my recipe book or something whenever I press that button. So, all right. So our topic today is fiscal sponsorship, although our header here is Welcome to the Commons, and we really see fiscal sponsorship in its current and evolving evolution as a vehicle for equity, as fundamentally a platform for sharing infrastructure, sharing resources, sharing know-how within the nonprofit community. So we really see those two things inextricably linked. And so we'll be touching on that theme as we go through our presentation today. I believe that in addition to sharing this video, the collaborative will also have access to this deck. As you see, we share all of our knowledge under a Creative Commons license. So we don't believe in holding things in the nonprofit sector kind of privately or extracting rent from them. So you are free to have this deck to reference in the future and share it as you will under our share alike license. So to go over sort of the order of show today. So we're going to divide today into two parts. First part is a real high-level view of what fiscal sponsorship is and its impact and why it's something of interest in our sector. We'll take a short break for a chat about that, and then we'll go into part two, which is more of the mechanics and functions of a couple of the key models. And then we'll close with a bit more conversation about that. So That is our agenda for today. So beginning with kind of why fiscal sponsorship and what a fiscal sponsorship. So a fiscal sponsor in our definition, and there isn't a universal legal definition for fiscal sponsorship. This is really an area of practice, just to be clear. The term fiscal sponsorship evolved in the 80s and 90s, largely owing to the work of Greg Colvin, which we'll talk about a little later, and was kind of widely adopted. We use the term commons manager or commons management as an equivalent term, but a fiscal sponsor or commons manager is an organization that essentially shares its core infrastructure, its backbone support. That means its legal form, its tax status, its kind of back office staff, which largely includes finance, HR, legal, basic insurances, and such, with multiple semi-autonomous missions and purposes. So that could be an artist and your practice. That could be an arts organization and its programs and services it offers. It runs the gamut. Couple quick myths about fiscal sponsorship, that it's only there for startups or sort of temporary projects. Certainly serves to support those kinds of initiatives in our world, but we see it more and more as a kind of permanent way of sharing infrastructure and capacity for the nonprofit community writ large. We also hear frequently that fiscal sponsorship sounds kind of exotic and untested. It really isn't. It's been around since 1959, and there's a lot of good case law that underpins it from a tax standpoint. So it's really quite established now. And finally, we're sort of moving out of an era where donors and funders were less familiar into one where they're much more familiar. So fiscal sponsorship's coming into its own. And there is still some lack of understanding out there that we see, particularly in philanthropy, but improvement has been quite a bit over the past years. So we're moving in the right direction. So what do fiscal sponsors provide? In terms of this shared resource, as I said, it's staff and board. So you are sharing governance. You're sharing in the governance process of the nonprofit, the fiscal sponsor that is providing this kind of shared platform. You're sharing their key staff. You're also sharing essentially their corporate structure, which includes their tax exempt status, their 501c3 status, insurances, et cetera. And you're sharing a lot of their systems, so how they manage documents, processes, procedures, policies. And finally, the fiscal sponsor is largely responsible for compliance on your behalf. So that means filing with the IRS, with state employment, tax regulators and authorities, all of those things that tend to keep us up at night, that actually is done by the fiscal sponsor on your behalf. So who do sponsors support? As we said, it's not only just for startups and individual projects. So it's largely individual change makers or groups of change makers in the case of collectives and collaborations. We see, particularly in the arts world and the collaborative world, fiscal sponsors being as a platform, as a shared platform, they can kind of act like Switzerland. They can be a neutral third party that can provide administrative and intermediary support to a collaborative or cooperative while still honoring whatever decision-making or governance structures that collaborative or cooperative has designed or developed for themselves. So fiscal sponsors can be there to work in concert with those structures of decision-making and empowerment. A little bit often unexpected, but we see by folks new to the field, but we see a lot of for-profit businesses that might have a charitable thing they want to do on the side that relates to their business, using fiscal sponsors to do that charitable program. So it could be a service provider or a manufacturer that has like an on-the-job training program or an education program that is charitable in nature. They might house that program under a fiscal sponsor and allow them to operate that program without having to stand up their own nonprofit. Also, we see existing nonprofits, 501c3s, that are particularly small. Most nonprofits in on the landscape are small. We have about 1.8 million nonprofits. About 90% of them operate below a couple million in budget, 80% below $500,000 in budget, and often very intentionally. So a lot of nonprofits are not meant to infinitely scale. They have their right size because they do a particular thing or serve a particular community, but they suffer because at that scale, it's hard to buy all of this infrastructure and pay for it. And so sharing it is often a more economical, accessible, and sustainable solution if you are intentionally modest in your budget size. So we see nonprofits moving under comprehensive fiscal sponsorship, not because they need the tax status, but because they want to share the resources. So a bit of history, don't want to spend too much time on this, it's a little geeky, but it's good to understand context.
Yes.
Even though fiscal sponsorship has been around a lot for a while, since 1959, we're just beginning to build the field. And so there's a bit of a disconnect because a lot of people feel like, well, seems like an old idea, or I've heard about it for a long time, but I still can't find a lot of information about it. There's a reason for that. There is not a lot of information yet out there about it because we haven't done that work as a field. That really just started to take off in the 90s and in the early 2000s with the establishment of the National Network of Fiscal Sponsors, our only peer. We were established in 2020, so we're barely 3 years old ourselves, and we're the first direct capacity builder that the field has seen so far. Despite that fact, the field has grown, and we hear, we don't have a lot of science on this yet, but we certainly hear every day that the greater reckoning with social equity, racial equity in our country, social justice, climate change, and the sort of increasing cadence of crises and disasters, our political divide and conflict have really led to a much more rapid growth in shared resource solutions, including fiscal sponsorship. So the chart here, you can see as it goes to the right, we see a big uptick. This is from a recent field scan of about 100 fiscal sponsors that we surveyed nationwide. 72% of those fiscal sponsors were founded after 2000 that responded to the survey. So we've seen a lot of new fiscal sponsor development. So it certainly is coming into its own. The motives we see behind that are a desire for more solidarity economy solutions. So fiscal sponsors as a kind of shared platform are very apt for folks interested in intentional community building or intentional sharing to build this as a solution. So fiscal sponsors can operate very much like cooperatives if you want them to. And we're seeing more BIPOC-led fiscal sponsors operating according to those values because that's a way to shift power and also not necessarily subscribe to the nonprofit industrial complex of mostly top-down white-led organizations, which is still the case in the nonprofit community today. So fiscal sponsors are a tool for power shifters. And so not only for the projects they support, but we're seeing Black and brown communities build fiscal sponsors for their communities and exclusively for their communities. Equity flows close upon that as a motivation, really thinking, again, if you think like a co-op, every project is sort of paying their fair share of a shared management solution, and that becomes a much more socially, politically, values-oriented solution for many communities. Finally, efficiency. If you can build one really, really good team and share it with lots of people, that's a lot easier than building 20 teams or filing 20 990s or doing 50 audits. You can do one audit well, much more efficient. And we did some study on this just from the economic side, actually with the arts community using the somewhat often maligned data arts data set. But it's a very rich data set. We sampled organizations in Pennsylvania, actually, and also in California. So a total of about 1,000 organizations operating under 2 million, and compared it to what those organizations would spend if they were operating under a comprehensive fiscal sponsor. And we'll talk about that term in a sec. And we found that dollars to donuts, they were spending 17 to 27% of revenue on what they could get equivalently by a comprehensive fiscal sponsor for between 9 and 12% 10 to 15%. So about a 10% difference that's you could call savings, or you could just think about it as money you don't spend on accounting and bookkeeping, and you can spend on art, mission, programs, front-facing things. So it's big. We have a $2.2 trillion sector. So think about what if we could take 10% of $2.2 trillion, which is a lot of dough, and move it to the front instead of spend it on the back. That's really what's at stake for us. So fiscal sponsorship's also doing a lot of expansion, certainly sponsoring projects that are mission oriented, but also offering donor and funder collabs. So we see a lot of fiscal sponsors branching out to host donor advised funds and donor collabs, as well as offering not just the back office services, but also development, capacity building, fundraising support. So really transformational services versus just transactional financial services is a trend we're seeing. We're not seeing enough of it yet, but we're moving in that direction, which is a good thing. So that means that it's not only that you get your checks written, but you actually have a partner there to help you raise the money you need to do your work. And that is, we see the future of fiscal sponsorship increasingly including those expanded services. And so to kind of wrap up this kind of overview and why section, we're moving from this kind of every person out there alone, leading their lives of quiet desperation, alone in the landscape, trying to build little organizations, to one that's coming together as intentional communities to really sustain their work, and particularly the Model A or comprehensive form, which we'll dive into in part 2, is being used for that purpose. And we're seeing fiscal sponsorship move from largely its history being very transactional and very kind of arm's length to being much more transformational. So there are many sponsors like Rainier Valley Corps up in Washington, which was actually Vu Lee's organization. If you know Vu from his blogging and kind of advocacy work and critique of philanthropy and all things nonprofit, they're a really transformational fiscal sponsor and one of the leaders in the field in that regard. So we're seeing fiscal sponsors really as collective capacity building, not just sort of a transitional way station to being your own nonprofit. It's a very different paradigm, but that's what we see as exciting about the future of this field. So if we do that, we feel that we can accelerate more money going to people and communities who have been traditionally excluded from that money. We can see much more just systems for sharing these resources, so more cooperativized approaches, which we see as essential to equity. We don't think there is equity without more cooperative power sharing. Those two things are interlinked. And if we can share costs and share infrastructure, we're all going to be more resilient, because the blows are not going to stop coming. Climate change is not going to get better, unfortunately, before it gets, or not going to, it's going to get worse. And, we are certainly far and away from winning the battle over civil society and equity in this country. So there's a lot more work to do. And the more we can share, the more resilient we'll be in doing it. So we see, and I believe this is our final bit for this first section, a real virtuous cycle where sharing resources can lead to more equity, efficiency, and capacity. And ultimately, the goal is more flourishing communities. So if everybody can wake up who has a desire to do social good, can just plug directly into the resources to do it, that's our vision. More people doing more work is the purpose. We don't, fiscal sponsors are really a voice against the traditional competitive dog eat dog, kind of more private sector visions of the nonprofit sector, being like our kind of private sector values around sort of scarcity and competition, to being much more oriented on plenty and sharing as kind of the paradigm that we're pursuing. So that's a bit of an overview. And if we can achieve that vision of more plenty, we see our nonprofit landscape moving from sort of being very fragmented and fragile to being very sort of regionally and culturally organized around hubs of sharing. We don't believe it should be rolled up into some dark tower somewhere. And we don't believe we should let Silicon Valley put it on the cloud. All of those are bad things. But we do see lots of local and cultural and identity focused fiscal sponsors arising on the landscape. And we see more of those being the future and the way to kind of guarantee resilience and growth for our sector.
Yes.
We will
Thank you.
pause.
Sorry. Yeah, thank you for all of that. I was jotting down notes. I'm also reflecting on kind of our fiscal sponsorship review, our literature review that our researcher Diane Walsh had provided and presented to the folks here at Arts Business Collaborative. I shared that information with you. So it is really fascinating to see really or to understand from internally within our org, to hear from you, because I know you're doing more of this work kind of like on a national scale, but understanding the gap that's being missed and understanding that there's a need, but there's a need for more of the co-collaboration. I mean, we hear about this in the universe of like philanthropy and how foundations are gifting, of course, a very small percentage of their profit, but they're gifting a portion of their revenue outward in the sense of grant funding, and how there's pushback from grassroots or from entities who are saying like, there's double dipping. You're giving to the same organization. And in the similar light, fiscal sponsorship is also operating that same way. So that last slide where you kind of showed the states, how there's all these individual nonprofits, but then like what it looks like to move into more of a network, like a cohesion effort where we are working alongside each other, it's really important, right? Like we're trying to shift the paradigm of like the status quo that's not been working. We know that, especially at least at Arts Business Collaborative, Black-led organization that supports primarily Black, Latin, and Indigenous organizations. We all know, we get it, right? Dollars are not necessarily moving to us. And similar to what you kind of uplifted in your presentation, to have like that comprehensive model, which Arts Business Collaborative certainly offers, but there is a lot more that goes into it. And I think that there are a lot of fiscal sponsors who are also starting to dive in and offer more to their projects, whether it comes to fundraising, whether it's helping them with like a boilerplate, and then connecting them, even if there's not funding that we as an entity structure might be securing as a nonprofit. If there's not a fit for us, that doesn't mean that it's not a fit for an organization that we're supporting and or an organization that might have approached us, that they couldn't be a fit for us, to still kind of draw that connection. Because in my mind, I think at the end of the day, if it's the audience that we're serving, whether they're in-house or external to us, it's the work that we want to see move forward. So that was all really helpful. I'm really curious, you mentioned or you shared in your deck that there was an uptick in 2020, and you mentioned that might have been around like solidarity, right? COVID, and then like kind of Black Lives Matter movement was really upon us, with the death of a lovely civilian. And I'm just curious, could it also be that, at least what we witnessed here at Arts Business Collaborative, all of those folks who had on their websites that Black Lives Matter, that like we want to make a big difference in our community. So we saw philanthropy, we saw funders who were insisting that they were going to meet their mission and move money out of the door. And so they had this huge push out the door. And we circle back. Here we are in 2023 and 2022, even when I first onboarded with Arts Business Collaborative, we were looking to collect narrative reports or narrative budgets. And these were things that typically, prior to COVID, most philanthropy would never touch you if you've not had an audit, if you've never written a proposal, if you don't even have a budget, right? Not just the budget in the Excel form, but also in the narrative form. But during COVID, there was a huge mass of money just moving out the door. Again, kind of COVID and Black Lives Matter, right? Simultaneously, that I would say that, to me, I think that that's when there was the uptick, that there was a mass amount of money that could be moved out the door. And unfortunately, and I know our CEO, Kat Bloomfield, mentions this quite a bit, and that is like, are we at a point where inherently you and I and folks who we work closely with know Black lives do matter, but the philanthropic standpoint, like, do Black lives continue to matter? Because that funding that we saw back in 2020, now, of course, I understand the pulse of the economy and where we are, that's a whole different ballgame, but that money is certainly not moving as quickly. So I'm curious, we saw the uptick and you saw it there in 2020 and 2021, kind of saw that bar graph, huge uptick, but it's actually starting to like mellow back out. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, I think there are two things just to kind of pull apart a little bit. One is, I think, just the organizing side of the sector and people wanting to organize and get work done. And yes, there's a need for philanthropy and money to do that. But some of the organizing we're seeing, particularly under fiscal sponsors, is also shifting away from traditional institutional philanthropy towards much more community-based fundraising, more in the tradition of, say, cooperatives or SUSUs or mutual aid societies, things of that nature. So, there is, I think, a virtue and a social movement around fiscal sponsorship as a collaborative and social justice kind of structure, or at least one that can be used that way. It doesn't always get used that way, but it can be used that way. It certainly isn't a cure for what ails philanthropy, because there are a lot of things that ail philanthropy. And I'm not sure, but I mean, there's a whole other webinar around that. But you're right in that we have seen a lot of philanthropic practices shed some of their inequitable things, like all these demands on grantees and overly burdensome restrictions and whatnot. And we are seeing that come back. So, we had these hopes that might change philanthropy. Well, guess not. Guess what? Not really, not so much. And even the excess spending that philanthropies were doing beyond their required 5% safe harbor for private foundations, for example, a lot of funders spent beyond their minimum during the pandemic in the early days of protests stemming from George Floyd's murder. Even that practice has kind of been ratcheted back. So now we're back to kind of the same, minimal standards. So, I don't think fiscal sponsorship necessarily is, and we still have a lot of philanthropy, by the way, that doesn't understand fiscal sponsorship, and that's a barrier too. So,
Right.
There's still a lot of problems remaining on the philanthropy side. There are ways that, with some glimmers of hope out there. Some philanthropies are, for example, having their grant staff write the grant proposal and the report on behalf of their grantees. That needs to be 100% of grant makers, because you got the money to pay the staff, hire people to do that work, and don't make grantees.
The systems, if you want to know how you have to report it back to your board of directors, right? I get it, or committee review. If you already know those internal processes of what it's supposed to look like, and you already are having these program officers or managers kind of like walk through the grant agreement and the different portals, or even if it's just in a narrative form, you're right. You're absolutely right. Like, let me speak to you. And there are some funders.
There are some that do it. Yeah,
they're just like, talk to me. And like, I've been on the other side where they're typing and like they're hearing what I'm feeding to them. They're interpreting it in the way that they need to in order to meet the needs of their committee, right? For review. And then they'll punt it back over to me and be like, make any additional revisions if necessary, which is really helpful and beautiful. I guess I'm just, again, reflecting back on that slide, on your deck, and how that particular bar graph, we saw that uptick in 2020 or 2021, and then it kind of came back down and averaged out. And I think it certainly was like, we have this abundance of money, we want to move it out into the universe. Typically it's a 1 year, maybe a 2 year, and now we're at the point in 2023 where, whether it's Arts Business Collaborative or even some of our fiscal sponsors that we're supporting, there's a real struggle with accessing grant dollars. And so within, Arts Business Collaborative, we're trying to shift, like, is it something, again, like looking at like this collaborative approach, as you mentioned, and I know you and I had a chance to chat before, and I really like the idea of kind of like, how do we remove language that sounds like a barrier or sticky or doesn't feel good? And so how do we push more for like this collaboration? What does it look more like of a share versus a fee? And how do we get kind of philanthropy, at least at Arts Business Collaborative? I'm thinking of more of this holistic approach to support our organization, but then how do we encompass those projects that we're pulling in, so that, yes, they can each individually apply for grant opportunities, but that they are seen within our organization. And essentially, they're, as you mentioned the other day, a program, right? The director of programs, there should be programs. Each of our fiscal sponsors should be a program, and we are finding a way to write them in some capacity within our budget. We're reporting on them.
Yep, totally. No, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I think so, you know, aside from the very progressive funders out there and our general, inability necessarily to fix all the philanthropic avenues, fiscal sponsors and groups like Arts Business Collaborative can do some things that are very powerful on that side. So once you've got a bunch of people sharing a resource like yours, and this has not been the historic kind of norm in fiscal sponsorship. It's been very, we make the trains run behind the curtain. We stay out of your business. We do not get into relationships with funders. We let you bring the funders to us, and we'll make sure the money gets accounted for, and all those things are done properly. But all that typically it rests with the project, and that was done, to be honest, out of an interest in preserving the project's autonomy. So the fiscal sponsor doesn't want to get in your business. They want you to be self-directing, have agency, have power over the decisions you care about. And that's been a healthy relationship, and I think that will continue to be a dynamic in the field, because there is healthiness in that kind of balance. But there are also ways that fiscal sponsors can proactively bring projects together and then go to a funder where they have a relationship and actually be a broker of relationships with funders that the project might not otherwise have. And we're seeing that happen. And you're not just going as one project, you're going as a group of projects. So there's strength in numbers. So you can show, a lot of this is, as we all know, the funding and philanthropy game in many ways is one about impact and metrics and all these things, which I think are highly problematic in the arts and culture field, but that's yet another webinar. But regardless, there's this need to kind of show scale, show impact, show all these, show that you're big, because big is always better in the United States. Unfortunately, it's one of our great cultural pathologies. We do not celebrate small, but small is actually how most work is done, how most impact is made in this world. But fiscal sponsors can allow those individual organizations the autonomy and independence of their mission, but also then bring them together when needed to be a force multiplier to leverage money where money could not be leveraged before. And you do have all of the, complex dynamics that have paternalism, that have racism, that have lots of things baked into them of, philanthropies not entrusting their money to certain size organizations or certain kinds of people, if we want to be really honest. And fiscal sponsors can be there as a bit of that. I think a lot of particularly equity-focused fiscal sponsors are not there to enable or reinforce that paternalism or racism built into the system. They're there for good intentions. However, practically speaking, often that's the reason the donor or philanthropy might give the grant, because they feel comfortable. They feel like the systems are there. There's somebody minding the shop that they trust. So, this issue of trust and how trust is built, fiscal sponsors can be positive avenues and aggregators of trust, and that can benefit all the projects. So if you're a new project that philanthropy's never heard of, they might start at a higher level of trust with you because you're affiliated with a sponsor. I'm not saying that's necessarily a good thing. I'm saying it's real.
It is.
And so, it's a question of how pragmatic we want to be or how political we want to be, right? So, I mean, these are not easy things to wrestle with, but they're real dynamics of the system, right?
It is. No, I mean, you hit the nail on the head. In my previous work, when I talk about fund development, I'm like, there's a love language that has to be shared from fund development when I'm engaging, philanthropy or program officers, right? Like, you have to speak their language. And so, yes, I recognize, at least at Arts Business Collaborative, I think is really beautiful, is that, we acknowledge that there's gaps in these systems. And so we're really big on not only, we're access to capital, knowledge, and network. So the knowledge is kind of what we're able to share with you. The literature review, we have some other research findings on our website that another lovely individual on our team, Erica Patterson, had done a deep dive around community-centric fundraising, which also is another series or conversation that we'll be having later on this month. But how do we like look at best practices, implement them within ourselves, within the groups that we're supporting, kind of within our network, our community, have that access to resources, whether that be the philanthropic world or whether that be, connecting a project to another project because a project is looking for, trailers that they're able to convert over into like little grow pods, because in New York City, it's very hard to find green space, right? Because they're hoping to have a community garden that could support local restaurants, with fresh produce. And so I think that there's beauty in that, and there's certainly like a level of challenge, right? Because you really uplift that. There's this theory; it's an endorsement, if you will, right? And we are in a season of politic, and I feel like we're always politicking, but it is kind of like I endorse this person, and you should too. And at the end of the day, like I think what is most troublesome to me is that maybe because I do know the systems and I do know how to articulate the same way, doesn't mean I don't have like I certainly don't have the passion as the project does, right? As that leader, that visionary who's connected to the community. So how do we shift? And I'm not suggesting that it's my work or even your work. It's someone's work, but not at this point in time, to shift philanthropy, to shift those committees to be able to like understand the connectivity to grassroots organizations, which we see, and we still know there's that gap. You mentioned yesterday, and you talked a little bit about today, and maybe we'll talk about it kind of in like this next phase, but collaborations, right? Like how foundations, you mentioned donor advised funds. We work in that space too. It's quite interesting, right? Like we're like, oh, X, Y, and Z, you want to be able to fund these organizations, and we're essentially your flow through, right? Like, do you actually have a partnership with us where we are establishing who those grantees are in partnership with you, or you're pretty much, we've identified them and here's the money and please move it, right? So how do we kind of, widely, I know that there's a national network of fiscal sponsorship, like, but how do we move more into like this collaboration, this collaborative effort and space, whether it's through fiscal sponsorship, whether it's even working with philanthropy as well, to like remove not necessarily us because we are the backbone, right? But to remove us from being the front face.
Right. Yeah, it's a complicated dynamic, right? Because you're constantly balancing, your own values and these moments where you're essentially enabling morbid and unjust systems or perspectives, in choosing to engage. And then you're balancing that with, well, I can actually move a meaningful chunk of money to this person and this project that really needs it. And that's, at the end of the day, it's very, it's looking at it very tactically and opportunistically and maybe Machiavellianly, and saying, well, if I get the money there, that's what matters. I don't think that's always true, though, to be honest. I mean, there was a project at the fiscal sponsor I founded in Philly. This was some years ago. It was a Black led and serving project, very community based. There was a very prominent white donor, individual donor. This wasn't an institution or anything. It was just an individual, and they knew of me, and they knew of CultureWorks, and this project was under CultureWorks at the time. And they called me for a check on the project. They said they wanted to give to the project. They'd read about the project, blah blah blah. And I was like, well, this is not the conversation I want to be having, right? Because I mean, just like that whole conversation, I was like, you should talk to the project. And apparently they had, but they just wanted they wanted my endorsement.
Yeah.
And it wasn't about whether I would give the endorsement. Of course I did, but the whole thing was just problematic. And so I went back to the project and I said, they called, and I said, I certainly told them they should support you, but I said, I think you should know they called me, and you can make a decision about whether you want to accept their money or not based on that. Because at the end of the day, you don't have to, and you can make a decision about whether that's a relationship you want. And I think that's important. I said, I don't have a dog in this race. That's your business. But I think as long as you remain kind of true to your community and your projects, and be transparent about those things, and just say, look, decision's yours. if you want to endorse what just happened or not. You know, and I would understand if you don't. And again, the person that just to be clear, the philanthropist was not operating from any nefarious thing, but wasn't even aware that what they were doing
Right.
kind of not cool, right? Or just again a perpetuation of all these systems and structures. There's no self-awareness there.
Yeah.
So, you know, and so I think as long as we remain in dialogue, you can kind of navigate those things, but there's not a quick fix for it. You know, it's just a very messy, complicated, very charged time we're in, particularly with philanthropy.
Yeah. And I'll add one more comment before we step into your phase two. I think that leads me to even a little bit, at least in this space since I've been here, wanting to really push back on philanthropy, right? So this idea or this notion that, you know, come the end of their fiscal year, they're like, we no longer have anything that we actually can exhaust out. And I'm like, actually, let's be clear. You can no longer exhaust the revenue or the profit you made on the 5% investment that lives right in the universe that continues to keep oppressed folks oppressed, but your mission says X, Y, and Z. And so how do we actually get you to be willing to, if there is something of value that you see, that it's not necessarily a no, we don't have it. It's let me circle back and advocate for this to happen because I know we do. I always tell projects that not all money is good money, right?
Yep.
And one will say, they're like, well, but we operate and we live in the embodiment of capitalism. And that we certainly do. But be mindful of like at what cost, at what way is it having you shift, right? Like there's this conversation, at least from like the nonprofit side and coming from someone who's been fund development, right? Like I've known to be careful to like not mission creep, to not shift the direction which I'm going, which is a beautiful thing here, you know, that I do at ABC and supporting our projects. And that is like we continue to fall back into that mission and vision. And what are you rooted in? And don't feel strayed because there might be somebody who has that $100,000 check who's approaching you and says, I really like your work, but could you? And then while kind of like dangling the carrot over your head, stay true to who you are. Because if you stay true to that mission and that vision, there's a likeliness that in year 2, 3, 5, that same person who is going to invest in you at that time is going to turn back around and want to invest in you even more at a later time because you had said no at that time. So saying no isn't always a hard no, might be a fast no, but it's not a forever no. It's a no right now.
I totally agree. I think that's spot on. In many ways, the first step to effectively changing the power relationship with capitalism is being able to say no. You know, and I think that's so few folks are, you know, in that the scarcity mindset kind of tends to foreclose. There's also actually, and this is kind of, you know, odd but very widespread. A lot of folks believe they can't say no legally.
Mm-hmm.
I've had lots of people ask, can I actually decline a grant or a gift? I'm like, absolutely. There's no legal obligation to accept a gift anywhere in the universe. But there's a sense of like, oh, well, it's been offered. I can't, you know, and I think it's good to, yeah, to do that self-check and that sort of values alignment. Is like, this is this capital that I want to let into the house. That's the metaphor I usually use. You know, would you let this in your front door? If not, then maybe you shouldn't. You know, it's a valid question, you know, and people do decline grants every day.
Yeah. And we've had the unfortunate, opportunity to have to do that as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
With some of our projects, we understand they provide for us because we request them the quarterly like updates of like what's going on with your organization. Mostly, again, not to hinder or harm them, but to keep them on track with
Sure.
like this is what you're interested in, and this is what you want to pursue. Now, if at any point in time you were to shift, right, like within that quarterly, you're like, this is the direction we want to go, and then down the line we look and see grant opportunities coming, that makes sense. But don't put the money in front of, or don't put the cart in front of the horse, is essentially don't get the money first and then want to divert and shift. You'll always continue chasing and you'll shift. And yeah, that would, to me, it would be a, cause or problem. But like at one point in time, like, do I hope for, at least as the programs director, to see these projects sustain,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Totally.
Versus dissolve, right? Or feel as though they have to give up on their vision or dream.
Yep. Great. No, that's all. Those are all great points. So shall we sally forth part two? Okay,
Yes,
let's see here. Okay, hopefully part two is now showing.
it is.
All right. Oops. Okay, there we go. So before we dive into the technical details, a couple of language things. Like most fields, fiscal sponsorship has its jargon. And one of the reasons we like management commons is we actually think fiscal sponsorship is really lousy as a term. It's kind of doesn't say anything and it sounds really geeky and all about money. And those are all things that people generally loathe and detest and run away from. So it's not terribly inviting. Management commons feels a little bit like, oh, we're managing together. And that seems intuitively a little bit more welcoming. So you'll see sort of there are a lot of terms for fiscal sponsorship, fiscal hosting that are coming up that are meant to be kinder, gentler, more welcoming. Nonprofit commons, we've heard. All of them are the same. Like I said before, there's no real legal specific definition that you must use. Other than a fiscal agent, we hear a lot. Fiscal agent is technically wrong for actually for legal reasons, and we could talk about that later. It's a little esoteric, but in general, either fiscal sponsorship or any of these others, except fiscal agent, is a generally accepted term. The term for whatever the activity is that's being sponsored or hosted, the project, the artist commission, the work, whatever it is usually called the project. And in fiscal sponsorship world, the project can be the equivalent of what would otherwise be an organization, just to be clear. And this is just a term of art. It's not, it doesn't really denote anything beyond that. Sometimes you hear sponsee. Some fiscal sponsors use member, partner, other terms of art to describe their sponsored projects. Project director is also a generic term you'll hear in the field. It describes the single person that represents the project's interests and is the authorized representative of the project to the sponsor. So in any basic working relationship, you need sort of two clear points of authority. And usually the sponsor has a clear sort of manager, member or community manager that is your point of contact as a project, and they have your role as project director as a point of contact. Usually projects choose who they want to be their project director. It could be a board member of the project, could be the ED, could be the artist if it's just one person, but that's the authorized partner. Model, and you hear the term model, we've heard it several times in the conversation, refers to this very specific alphabetical organization of the different fiscal sponsorship models that was done by an attorney named Greg Colvin in the early 90s. There is a book on it if you really want to geek out. But Colvin's models have sort of taken hold in the field and are used commonly to reference these different approaches to fiscal sponsorship. There are 6 or 7 or 8, depending on how you count, different models. There are really sort of 2 that rise overwhelmingly to the top in terms of common practice out there, and are the ones that you might have, or you probably have heard of in one form or another. So Model C, we'll start with that one, is also called the pre-approved grant fiscal sponsorship. That's a lot of words. Sometimes it's called the pass-through model, although we're not supposed to use that word either, because the IRS doesn't like that. But it is a model that folks usually use for very project-based work. It's very common in the arts community. Fractured Atlas, for example, is a Model C fiscal sponsor exclusively, and they're very well known and regarded in the arts community, as we know. It's often used for organizations that are seeking their tax exemption. They don't have it yet, so they need sort of a stopgap. They need to be able to receive gifts and grants, so they use Model C. Model C always entails a fiscal sponsor, a 501c3, and a project. The project is usually non-exempt, meaning that they're not a 501c3. They could be a person, just your Social Security. You file your 1040 every year as a person, or it could be a for-profit formation like an LLC or a corporation or an S corp, anything. And the fiscal sponsor is agreeing to receive contributed revenue, charitable gifts or donations, this would be grants or individual donations on your behalf. They receive them and they re-grant them to you, and then you have responsibility to spend them, to do the end spending and management of that money. You report on just the charitable amount back up to the sponsor, who then reports back to the funders. So it's a bit of a chain, but it's a re-granting model. That's the legal construct, which is why it's called a pre-approved grant, fiscal sponsorship. So when the money moves from the sponsor to you, it is a re-grant from the sponsor. Came as a grant from the donor originally, and then they re-grant it to you. This is kind of a lighter touch form, but it's very prevalent. If you're looking to, and in the Model C form, to be fair, you're sharing some portion of the sponsor's management. So they're receiving the funds for you, they're taking responsibility for them charitably. Their board is responsible from a fiduciary standpoint for those funds. But ultimately, from a day-to-day, like bill paying standpoint and employing standpoint, you, the project, are responsible for everything else. It's all you. The comprehensive form of fiscal sponsorship, true to its name, is a lot more, and that's Model A. And it is essentially a situation where your work becomes a direct program of the sponsor. You are in-house, so to speak, just like any other program. And you're sharing all of the back office things the fiscal sponsor does. So the finance team, HR, legal, general liability insurance, all those things. And this is really sort of a true commonized management model, which is why I referred to it earlier. This tends to be, both can be a long-term scenario. There was some projects are in long-term Model C relationships. But Model A can actually be a long-term substitute for having any legal formation at all, because the project, you don't need to have anything. You could transact with an individual, but you don't need to have your own bank account, build any infrastructure if you don't want to. You can have that all through your fiscal sponsor. If your goal is to eventually become independent, you certainly can start to build that on the outside and then transition out eventually. But Model A you can just be a person with an idea, and all of your management administration happens through the sponsor, which is why it's comprehensive. So these are some schematics of both those models, just to kind of further clarify. So the Model C, you got funding sources over here, and just note that the funding sources there are all charitable. They're all contributed. There's no earned revenue generally involved. So earned revenue is when you are selling things, people are paying for a good or service. So if you sell tickets or you sell your artwork, that is earned revenue. That typically doesn't get involved with Model C. It's only stuff that needs a tax letter to transact. So that's grants, government, corporate, individual, goes to the sponsor. There's a fiscal sponsorship agreement, or an FSA, between you, the project, and the sponsor that concretizes all of this. But most fiscal sponsors either fully reimburse, and they're wholly reimbursement based, or they provide advances on money and then expect reports in return. There are a couple different ways to do it, but the bottom line is the sponsor re-grants the project the money. The project then does the spending and work with the money, then reports back up to the sponsor, and then the sponsor, of course, ultimately has to report to any funders or donors if that's required. Model A looks a little different. It's a little simpler because it kind of is in many regards. All income goes to the sponsors. So that's an important difference. So including earned, you'll see at the bottom. And the sponsor is your bank, your compliance, your corporate entity, and you as the project are kind of inside the sponsor. You still instruct the sponsor. You still have independence of identity. You still have independence of decision making over most of the aspects of your work. But the sponsor is paying and doing all the bill paying, insuring on your behalf directly. So you don't have to write any checks. You are instructing the sponsor as to what bills you want to pay, but they are paying the bills for you. And that keeps all the liability off of you. So you could be a person just without any corporation. You could be running a very large project, and the only money that you would receive is wages or fees for your work. So conceivably you would be paid for your work on the project, but all the other money you don't have to manage come tax time as kind of income and, file a Schedule C that's 5 miles long and all this kind of nonsense that tends to happen. That all lives with the sponsor and it's clean and clear from you. All you get is the money that is actually income to you as the project director, for example. So this is the Model A form. Quick comparison. I mentioned earlier this sort of research we did on independent formation. That just means you standing alone outside with your own nonprofit, just like many people do. Mentioned that our kind of study yielded a sort of 17 to 27%. And these percents at the top in terms of costs of fiscal sponsorship are expressed in percent of revenue, which is the convention. Some fiscal sponsors assess costs on expenses. It's less common. The most common is revenue. So for comprehensive fiscal sponsorship, the national average is between 10 and 15%. And for Model C, the pre-approved grant model, it ranges between 4 and 8. These are not hard and fast. There are no laws governing these allocation rates. These are sort of business conventions, if you will, of the field, and you will see lots of variability. It doesn't mean it's wrong if it varies, but just to be clear, if you're negotiating, if you're seeking Model A and somebody offers you 20%, you should look a little skeptically at that. Or if they're offering Model A and they offer you 2%, you should also look a little skeptically at that and say, well, how is it that you're able to do all this for 2%? Are you raising money? Just understand how the sponsor's covering their costs, because you are sharing costs with the sponsor. Make sure you've got a square deal with the sponsor. And these are just some guidelines in terms of what you should anticipate in terms of costs that come at you. And these allocation rates, we call them cost allocations. Some sponsors call them fees. We generally sort of dislike that kind of arrangement because it feels very transactional, like you're buying a sandwich at the lunch counter. And really what you want is a partnership with your sponsor. You're not there to buy, it's not a retail business. At least it shouldn't be, in our opinion. So there's, I won't go through all of these in all detail, but these are some of the sort of division of labor, if you will, in the relationship, what the sponsor is responsible for, what you're responsible for as a project, and how you kind of share the relationship. Broadly, projects always have the ability to remain independent in terms of their identity, decision-making, resource allocation, budget, how you form your programs and missions. That's all in the project. The sponsor should not be meddling in your work unless you request it. So a lot of sponsors also offer coaching, consulting, technical assistance, shoulder to cry on. Those are all good things, as long as they're opt-in and not forced upon the project. So that's typically the stance of the project. The sponsor then is responsible for everything fiscally, ultimately. So the project, you have a lot of decision-making latitude, but you still will have to abide by certain basic policies and practices set by the sponsor. And this is where people often get very nervous and they're like, well, I don't want somebody else telling me how to do my business. A good sponsor should keep really good, basic, healthy management practices. I was a sponsor, I like to say in response to that, the only thing we're going to tell you not to do is something you shouldn't be doing anyway. There's something that's going to harm you or be illegal, whether you intend it or not. Our job is to make sure that, not assuming nefariousness, but we see particularly a lot of folks who are not familiar with the sector will want to do things that unbeknownst to them are just not a thing. And so the sponsor should be there as guardrails to make sure that the project does not get in trouble, because the sponsor also would get in trouble. Everybody's in it together. The sponsor should not be there to stop you from doing what you're doing. Fundamentally, they should be there just to make sure that nothing goes awry as you're doing it. So that's the basic nature of the relationship. One of the key differences between being just your own nonprofit and being, say, comprehensively sponsored is that all fiscal sponsorship relationships entail the ability to exit, and the decision to exit lies with the project, meaning you are not held captive. You may leave, usually subject to processes and procedures. You can't just kind of like up and go overnight and vanish. But you can initiate exit if, for whatever reason, you have your own nonprofit now, you're not getting along, you don't like the services, the rings of Saturn are not in alignment, whatever the reason is, you can say, I want to leave and go to another sponsor or go out on my own as a nonprofit. That's the essential difference. If you're an in-house program of a nonprofit and you're the program manager, like the head of education at a major museum, you can't walk into the office one day and say, I'm taking my education department somewhere else. That's usually not part of the picture. But in a fiscal sponsorship relationship, that autonomy to move is a key determining factor. And you should see that in every agreement. That's an essential part of every fiscal sponsorship agreement. There should be a clear clause that tells you how that works. And if you don't see it, you should make sure it's in there. Push back on that.
Yeah.
That's an important thing. There should be clear exit terms, clear processes. All that should be transparent. There's a little bit of a comparison, just kind of apples to apples of what you get as kind of core services, if you will, or core supports under C versus A. There's some commonality, of course, but you just kind of get more stuff under A than you do C. That's why you pay a little more for A. And then there's often like a la carte stuff. So if you want super special insurances, if you juggle chainsaws, or suspend yourself from bridges. We had a dance company that was their thing. They did it suspended from bridges, and that required a little bit of special insurance, as you can imagine. But that was additional cost to them, but we covered their basic needs as part of the cost allocation. And other special stuff. So the additional services there are like real estate and errors and omissions, or what those acronyms stand for. But this is a little bit of the comparison of the services. Whoops. Oh, sorry, my computer's a little wonky here. So finally, the last little bit, this just kind of shows at a higher level the kind of relationship organizationally between the project and the sponsor. So on the left, we have the fiscal sponsor with its board of directors. It really is the principal fiduciary holder of activity legally, if we wanted to kind of get down to brass tacks. But there is some shared fiduciary responsibility with the project. As the project's making decisions, you're making decisions, you have responsibility for those. Projects often, don't have to, but often have advisory boards that sort of act like a regular board in all respects, except they're not responsible. They don't have the same legal liabilities and responsibilities that the board of the sponsor does. But they often act in other ways, like they advise, they advocate, they raise money, they help create strategy, they do all the things boards do, but they do it for the project. And you'll see under the staffing side, the division of labor, and it really is a co-management relationship, is almost akin to a program within a larger nonprofit. So you've got your program, the project director is like the director of the program, and then you've got your kind of core staff, your executive team, you've got your finance, your HR, your legal team that are shared by multiple programs. It's very similar to a garden variety nonprofit with multiple programs. But you're just sort of a little bit of separation, and you have the ability as the project to say goodbye if you want to say goodbye, and go somewhere else. So that's just a brief overview of some of the basic mechanics of those two models, because those are the ones you're going to see most commonly, and sort of how they're used in the field.
Yeah, thank you again. All really helpful information for those who, will be watching this, panelist conversation webinar on YouTube. I think like some of the things that you really uplifted, and you mentioned the different, like, if you were to be independent and to kind of show the differentiation of like what you'd be investing into your vision, right, at different points, whether it's, again, you're an independent, you're model A, you're model C. What I'm hearing as I'm watching you present and talk through, and I think it's really critical for any of the fiscal sponsors or projects or visionaries out there who might be watching this, is making sure you hit the nail on the head, Thaddeus. You said a healthy relationship, right? So if there are things that you're seeing kind of in the onboarding process, if there's not a clause to exit, if there's not someone who's advocating for you in an MOU agreement with like, an LOI agreement with a funder, right? That's advocating to protect your rights as an artist, right? For your great work. It might be a moment to pause and shift. And I know that, here at Arts Business Collaborative, we cannot meet all the needs of the folks who come to us. There has to be certain alignment within the mission itself, but that they are art centered, or that they're STEM centered, that they're Black, Latina, or Indigenous, and of course, like doing that work in their communities. But the healthy relationship is something that I think we really need to explore and talk a little bit more about. And I'd like to talk about this a little bit with you, Thaddeus, and that is understanding, and I think internally we are looking at kind of the fees that you and I talked about a little bit yesterday, as far as that fiscal share. I'm going to shift that, like that share, right? Like, what is the healthy balance? Because I think that there is so much back end work, and naturally, again, I am a small business owner. Thaddeus, you also have launched a social impact, collective cooperative. And so how do we convince other small entrepreneurs or visionaries like ourselves to entrust that someone is not necessarily aiming to exploit you, even though it might feel that way? Because I know, as a small business owner, right, or like this social impact, I call myself the inspired director, that like pennies add up. And so I'm always fearful. And it's like that scarcity mindset of feeling like what might be exploitative of me is not really exploitative, but it is cost savings that I just don't see just yet. So I want to talk a little bit about that, or get your insight. But then also, again, that healthy relationship. So how do you find that balance? We're looking at the chart, that last slide, where you talk about, like, there's the board of the BOD, the board of directors for the fiscal sponsor, and then its team. And then here's the advisory committee of the individual organization and that individual and their team. And you don't want to meddle. But how do fiscal sponsors ensure that projects or sponsors, as you identified, are doing the work that they're stating in their mission, if there's not the expectation of a report or a narrative or a touch point, right? Like, I have monthly meetings with our fiscal projects. There's the quarterly updates that are requested. And I don't perceive it as being meddling, and I've not received feedback that it's meddling, but I certainly can imagine that it could even feel a little intimidating, especially as a small entity or structure or individual who, again, is just like, I want to just do this really great thing.
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's a really perennial, very intensely asked question today in our social justice context, because accountability and oppression get equated.
Yeah.
And they are different. I personally think that mutual and accountability is also, there's also a key adjective missing from a lot of these conversations. That is the adjective mutual accountability.
Yes.
So accountability is often understood as one way, and it's usually the powerful saying, chop, chop, you've got to do all these things for me. And if you don't, or else, right? And I mean, that's the classic, relationship that people are concerned with, rightfully, right? Like, who wants to be in that? Who wants to be the one-sided account in that relationship? In a healthy fiscal sponsorship relationship, it is mutual accountability. So both sides have responsibilities to each other and understand those responsibilities, nurture those responsibilities. When things go wrong, and they will, the attitude is, how are we going to fix this together? Not, how did you screw this up? Or, not blame storming, not finger pointing, but real cooperative problem solving, because it has to happen. That's the healthy relationship. So I think it really, language matters, how you show up matters, how accountability system. I mean, I think accountability, is a good thing, unequivocally. I'm unequivocally pro accountability, as long as it's mutual.
Yeah.
And it's also how you do it, right? Is accountability, making a project do, 50-page reports, or is accountability, hey, let's have a 10-minute chat, every month, right? Like a check-in, and you just tell me how it's going, and I'll tell you how it's going, and we'll solve whatever problems are, and then we'll go away. How can we make it easy? So I think a lot of the things that become inequitable or become oppressive are more of the how, not the what of working together, right? So, because you can't have accountability if there's no communication, or there's no dialogue happening, because how do you know? I mean, in the fiscal sponsorship relationship, there is a difference. If things go really, just to kind of state the extreme case, if a project really struggles, hopefully the sponsor can do their best to, and hopefully the project comes to the sponsor and says, I'm really struggling, before, help me. And hopefully the sponsor can help. But sometimes there's, sometimes, business models don't work out for whatever reason, or circumstances change, or forces beyond anybody's control, come into effect. And, sponsors at that point really leave the decision, to the project. If the project is out of money, the sponsor has no choice but to say, we can't pay any more bills. Like, we can't accept any more liabilities. We're not going to pick up your tab. So there is a moment where like an organization might step in if it's a program that's struggling and really kind of, save it or allocate resources. Fiscal sponsors usually try to draw a line there and say, look, you are your agent and your destiny as a project. And if we're there to help you succeed, but if ultimately you either voluntarily say, I'm out, I want to stop this, that's your right. So you can shut your own project down and we're not going to argue with you. And B, if you really struggle, there will be a point at which we're going to say, we can't help anymore. Because we're not going to go into debt for you. We're not going to continue paying a salary with money that doesn't exist. None of that's just or right. So there is a significant responsibility borne by the project. Like as though you're yourself. Like if you're there alone and you run out of money, same thing happens. You still can't pay yourself unless you can go find money. It's still your problem to solve as the project. So that's the difference between, say, an in-house program and a project. I think there are, in the cost of value question you raised, which is a really thorny one and really good one. There's a complex set of forces I've observed in that, is that 10%, is that a good deal, right? And there are some very real perceptual barriers in using percents because we equate those with other extractive instruments in the world, like credit cards and debt, right? When we see a percent, we think APR on our credit card. Think, whatever the bank is overcharging us for, the privilege of using their services, all that kind of stuff. So I think percents are kind of trauma-inducing in the world and often immediately read in a certain way. So when somebody sees 10%, they see extraction, right? And they don't see share, they see extraction. And I think that's unavoidable. I mean, that we've created that beast. We live in a predominantly capitalist and extractive economy. People are getting screwed every day of the week and twice on Sunday. And it's reasonable that people are wary. And in particular, communities that have been far over extracted historically forever since the beginning of time, right? And so I think entering the fiscal sponsorship relationship, it really matters how you start that conversation and how you present that allocation, or that share. And I had learned that firsthand, just working very closely with Black and Brown communities who had that immediate recoil from that and said, you're the man just trying to get your VIG, and this is more, and I get it, totally makes sense. I can't say there's an easy solution, but really just reframing things in that cooperative manner and really being transparent about that and honest and open about that, I think helps. There's the other dynamic of everybody thinks they can do it cheaper themselves. That's human nature, right?
Yes.
That's I can knock it in with the knee. I might have my Uncle Bob does that. He'll do it for free. My Aunt Susie does the other thing. I can get that for free. And it's great if you've got Uncle Bob and Aunt Susie. They're rarely going to hopefully match the level of acumen that you can get from a sponsor or people who actually, do this stuff. And who are also getting paid to do it, a fair wage. I think that's always a more sustainable thing to make sure there's a good, exchange of value, and that leads to more sustainable economies. So, we know that the nonprofit community is woefully underinvested. People are underpaid, underinvested, and they're used to being very resourceful. I actually happen to think that artists are the most resourceful managers. They get often told they're bad managers, right? That's the narrative. I think artists are the most resourceful managers because they're creative and they're used to just figuring stuff out. Like, I've got nothing. I got a
Seriously.
bar, with some costumes. We're going to put on a play, and that's how it's going to work, right? And so their response to a lot of artists' response to fiscal sponsorship is like, no, I got this. I've done the barn and costumes thing. I can do this too. And they probably can. I'm not saying that that's impossible, but it's going to be, it's going to be painful, and it's going to have a cost somewhere.
Yeah.
And the biggest thing in the arts community, I see, we have this very paternalistic, the funding community decades ago, and I remember, I'm old enough to remember like living through this moment, had this, what they thought was a brilliant idea. We're going to train artists to be managers. We're going to teach them accounting. We're going to, all this kind of stuff. Very paternalistic. And it was also assuming that these were skills they didn't already have, which I think is really kind of insulting. But, my perception of the arts community is not that artists can't do this work, is that there's not enough hours in the day to do it.
So say time.
Time is art. You should not be doing your bookkeeping. I'm sorry. It's not that you can't, and it's not that thousands and hundreds of thousands of artists don't do it every day because they have to, or they're not, they haven't put any other solution in place. But if you don't have to do that and you can spend more time on your work, why wouldn't you? Right.
Yeah.
And it's really it's an economy of time issue, not competency. And I feel like the sector has infantilized artists, assuming that there's a lack of competency there when it really is just about time and effort. And then you've got like family, and you've got all the other things in life. When do you do keeping for your thing? That's really the question, right?
Yeah, well, I think, you're answering it for me. You're giving me insight. Again, this is a shared, panelist conversation that's supposed to be shared outward, but I'm even taking notes that I think are really helpful for me in this role and within the organization of ABC. But, we talk about, again, like the healthy relationship, and that healthy relationship is mutual. So how do we meet halfway? And when we talk about that fee, and when you're mentioning like the artist who like is trying to figure out, because time, we are all limited with time, from my 10-year-old to my 16-year-old to, me, to my relatives, my great grandfather who's like 94, right? Like this idea of like there not being enough time in the world. How do you delegate? How do you entrust that someone else who, like, I always say this about like my program in Detroit, like I might be the visionary behind this model, but I am not the educator. I'm not the director, right? Like there's a certain skill set. In my mind, you are the expert in your field. And if I can empower you so that you have a salary, so that you are doing what you love and you're passionate about doing, because this is what you know,
right,
then why not? I can try it, but like you're an expert. So think again, as you mentioned, like that mutual agreement and understanding, kind of like that healthy relationship, that balance. It's how do we at ABC or any other fiscal sponsor show up at the table and not see it as a service, but we're relational to you. So it might feel like, oh, 10%, or even upwards of 19%, 18%, whatever we see out here, right? Like it might feel a little sticky. If it seems too sticky or too good to be true, then it probably is, right? As you mentioned, that 20% or 21%, the 2%. But the idea is like I'm in partnership, or other fiscal sponsors are in partnership with you, and to see it in that way, to see it as, yeah, I might be salary, but it means because each of the projects are contributing towards me, right, in my role, but also to like my benefits. But then like if there's a program manager, if there's a program associate, if it allows for our organization to grow, to impact and reach more in the network of projects or sponsors who are interested in having the support. It's the conversation. I think, at least again, in my very short time here at ABC, since mid-February of 2023, I have been really like diving in to build those relationships with the projects. And we hear not only from the projects, we see it in the reports that are coming over quarterly, but even from the foundations that are funding them, like, oh my goodness, right? Speaking at volumes. Now, granted, should they be telling me at volumes that they're proud to see a project move in the direction that they were hoping for? Or should they be relaying that champion, that excitement, that thrill to
Mhm.
the project themselves, right? Like that's enough. Like, okay,
Totally.
like here's half circle, like I need you to do full circle and go back to that project and tell them how, proud or moved you are. And then at the same time too, like continue your investment, right? Because like those first 2 years, like, yes, that's beautiful. That's great that you secure that for them. But like, let's have a further conversation, a further investment to see them continue moving along. And then also one thing that, when I think about like how ABC is kind of infiltrating and supporting its projects, right? Like how are we also encouraging the foundations to see, as I just mentioned, that 2-year commitment. Hey, project, we want to invest in you. Here's a multi-year grant. We'll circle back and give them a multi-year grant, but then empower that body, that project that you just supported, so that they are now mentors
Mhm.
to mentees who you look to fund for the first year for a new project for multi-year, right? Like that's we're taking the knowledge, right? The access knowledge network external to ABC, and our hope is that we can push it into the projects that we're supporting, so that they can continue to like change it within like the broader system of the philanthropic space, and that they hopefully are listening and willing to like adapt that model and also
Great.
move it into new projects that they're supporting. So this has all been really great and exciting. I'm appreciative. You shared a lot of knowledge and resources for us here between me and you, and for whoever's watching the webinar. And I appreciate too that you are willing to share your deck for folks. That it is a shared tool, that is not self-owned, and that you have rights to it, but that you're willing to share that tool with folks in the community. I think is really resourceful and helpful. It would be helpful to me because I'm going to reference it. I really want to kind of circle back on that uptick that we saw and where funding is going. And that research again was out of Pennsylvania and California.
Yeah, the comparative economic, like, what does it look like by yourself versus under a fiscal sponsor? That was done in southeastern Pennsylvania and California with data arts data, the what SMU data arts data set. And the
Nice.
reason we use that is it's very, as you probably painfully are aware, it's very granular. So it's not just what's on the 990, it's a lot more detailed, right? And so we were able to really drill down into those organizations' self-reported operating data and sort of really get apples to apples, like pull out that admin stuff and compare it to what you get from a sponsor, kind of apples to apples. Because the other piece about this whole cost conversation that's hard is just the difficulty of talking about overhead, right, and admin costs, because there is no. I mean, fortunately, we're moving away from this kind of like nonprofit shouldn't have any overhead nonsense and all this kind of. I mean, there's a cost to operate anything, and you can't operate with zero support. And I think, but there's also no precise science about how we calculate that, how we quantify it, how we talk about it in terms of value. So it's a very kind of constantly shifting conversation. The nice thing about, there have been other studies that have looked at arts in the nonprofit sector broadly, and have seen overhead rates north of 50% for some different nonprofit models.
Yeah.
Particularly advocacy orgs tend to kind of just show a very high overhead. Doesn't mean that they're inefficient. It's just because of what they do. It's different.
Yeah.
The nice thing about fiscal sponsorship is it fixes that, at least a piece of that,
Mm-hmm.
and you kind of know what that is in your budget, as opposed to having it go like this. You don't know next year your insurance is going to double. Well, you got to eat that if you're alone. If that happens to fiscal sponsor, they're still allocating to your 10%. So it helps to kind of like, lock in some of that overhead, which can be very, very variable. But anyway.
Yeah. No, and I think also too, like when we talk, I'll close out by saying that when we think about like that shared fee or shared expense, what I think something that I know we're doing, and that is we provide each of our projects on a monthly basis, their expense and revenue, right?
Yep.
Budget to actual. And I think would be really impactful for us as an organization, especially around like transparency, which I know, again, we spoke about yesterday when we kind of did a little brief run of show, is the importance of being transparent around each of the projects you're supporting and like where their expenses are going and like how we're able to pool. You mentioned you just did all that data kind of gathering between Southeast Pennsylvania and California, and it was very granular. But how do we at ABC kind of demonstrate like the revenue that comes in, but which project? And it doesn't have to be the specific project, right? We don't have to like be exploitative and saying like this project is doing phenomenally well. Look at what they're bringing in. But
Mhm.
A, B, and C, right? And demonstrating like what are their personnel or their salaries, what are their expenses, and demonstrating more broadly why our fees are what they are or why our shared fee cost might be what it is, but then also to those projects they can visibly and clearly see right there that this actually did cost quite a lot. If your budget within our organization is millions of dollars, please understand that this is what it costs for us in order to be able to sustain and support your organization at that rate versus the project or organization that might only be at 50,000 or 10,000, right? Because it's a one-off project. So
Mhm.
all really helpful information. I again appreciate your time and sharing this space with me and sharing this wealth of knowledge really with the wider community. Um, and
Pleasure.
I will hope to connect with you again soon.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity. It was a pleasure to talk to you today, Krista. All right.
Take care
Have a
now.
good one.
Thank
Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
you.